Well, good afternoon, and welcome to the final panel of a very, very rich and interesting day. I want to start also by acknowledging really the important role of Weatherhead East Asian Institute at Columbia University. It really not only 75th anniversary, but it's just really the hub of engagement around Asia very, very broadly. I myself have had the privilege of being exposed when I was a law student at Columbia in the 80s, and then when I returned here as faculty in the mid-90s, have been affiliated with Weatherhead ever since, and it's just an extraordinary place. At the current moment, I think dynamic great leader, and I particularly want to acknowledge Professor Tsuruoka's work bringing this all together. I know that Ayumi has been working with Keio since June to bring this about, and we're very, very pleased to have this collaboration. I think this last panel has a big assignment because I think coming off of today's discussion, we've been invited to think about what kind of international order might evolve after these elections and in light of major global political developments. I've been saying for some years now this old phrase by Gramsci that the old are dying and the young have not yet been born, to describe this period we're in history. And I think that's how the day started, actually, with the first panel saying the world was changing. And I must say, I thought that one way to manage through the moment was to find constructive incremental strategies without trying to build too much of a global architecture, and finding coalitions of the willing around select areas where we could, at least on the economic and trade front, rather than building new multilateral frameworks. That constructive incrementalism was best that we could achieve. But I think the complexity of the geopolitical environment that we've been talking about all day, is suggesting some very, very dramatic changes that are potentially underway strategically and geopolitically. And I think this last panel offers us an ability to talk most directly about those. I think we'll start with Professor Biddle. And I won't introduce him because that's been our tradition of the day, but he is really such a leading expert on issues of international security. And Steve, I don't know if you were here how much of this afternoon, but really one of the big questions coming out of the last session was how are things likely to go or might go in the Ukraine? And because the role, how that unfolds and the U.S. role will have profound implications for U.S. credibility and the evolution of developments in the Asia Pacific. So I think I'm not quite sure where you were thinking you might address, but I think as you speak to conflicts around the world, including in Ukraine, I just want you to be aware of that question that's in the air as we go forward. I think he will be followed by Yuichi Hosoya, professor at Keio University. Thank you very, very much. And then Zoe Liu and Professor Tsuruoka. So thank you all very, very much, and let me invite Steve Biddle to start us off.
Thanks, Merritt. My marching orders were to look at the current situation in both Ukraine and the Middle East wars sum up where we are, talk about the prognosis for where they'll go under a Trump administration. That's a lot of real estate to cover in 10 minutes, but I'll do what I can. So, well, starting with Ukraine, the war in Ukraine had been largely stalemated after about the autumn of 2022 until about 6 months ago, when Russia has been able to use an increasing advantage in kind of raw material strength and especially manpower to begin to take ground at a significantly higher pace than we'd seen in the previous year and a half of the war. The war is still a positional contest of attrition. Ground gain is expensive, it's slow, but the pace of that expensive, slow ground gain has picked up significantly, especially in the Donbass. The Ukrainians, seeing this, took something of a wild gamble by invading metropolitan Russia and the Kursk Oblast beginning last August. But that offensive was militarily self-limiting. It was only able to take a relatively modest amount of Russian territory, and it then halted. The Russians in the last month or so have been counterattacking pretty aggressively and have retaken something like about half of the ground that the Ukrainians were able to take in August and early autumn. So at the moment, I think the Russians are feeling modestly ascendant and are increasingly optimistic about what they're going to be able to do on the ground, at least through the end of the next 10 to 12 months. So that brings to the question of Trump and what's going to happen when he takes office in January for the future of Ukraine. The conventional view has long been that Trump will insist on an early deal that will essentially sell out the Ukrainians, will either execute or will threaten to execute a cutoff in American aid, military and economic aid to Ukraine, and will hand the Russians at the bargaining table what the Russians have been trying to achieve on the battlefield, and that this will bring about a termination to the conflict, but on terms very adverse for the Ukrainians. And certainly that is a possibility. It's not the only possibility, and it may not even be the most likely one at this point. And the problem here is the recent Russian ascendancy. The Russians' expectations for what they're going to be able to get on the ground are increasing significantly over time. The kind of deals that people had been talking about, in which Russia would be awarded all the ground they now hold in Ukraine, plus the ground they want but have not yet taken in the Donbass, probably is not the extent of Vladimir Putin's current ambitions for Ukraine. It's likely that Putin believes that he can get quite a bit more than that, and it's likely, given Donald Trump's much noted antipathy for the state of Ukraine, that he anticipates that he'll be able, either at the bargaining table or on the ground militarily, to get considerably more than that. And so far, the public statements from the Russian government in recent months have been remarkably ambitious with respect to the war aims that they think they're pursuing in Ukraine. They're essentially totalistic. They want regime change in Ukraine, they want neutralization of the country, they want everything that they thought they were going to get in February 2022 when they invaded. And this shouldn't be surprising. Countries that are ascendant militarily often expand their war aims accordingly. That in turn means that if Trump wants a deal but doesn't want it to look like Donald Trump's Afghanistan, in which the perception globally is that a weak United States allowed its ally to simply be steamrollered, it's not clear that he's going to be able to get a deal that doesn't look like Trump's Afghanistan without threatening the Russians with quite a bit more forceful U.S. military posture toward the country than anybody has been expecting from an incoming Trump administration, or than the Biden administration has been willing to threaten the Russians with to date. If Donald Trump is as intent on deal-making as many people expect him to be, he's famously unpredictable, so all bets are off as to what he's actually going to do. But if he really wants a deal, is really determined to get it, is really determined to have that deal not look like a simple, straightforward sellout that makes him look like the progenitor of another Afghanistan withdrawal, he may very well be forced to threaten the Russians with very aggressive degrees of escalation that are potentially quite dangerous. So I think we're looking at a moment in which the potential threat to other countries' interests emerging out of the Ukraine war could quite plausibly be increasing quite a bit, given Trump's demand to get a deal and given the dynamics of what a deal may very well require once we get ourselves into a January timeframe. So let's just very quickly shift gears to the Middle East. Apologies for the 20,000-foot flyover treatment of Ukraine. I trust we'll, in Q&A, get a chance to drill deeper on aspects of this than the unbelievably quick version you just got. Providing an unbelievably quick version of the Middle East. The Israelis at the tactical and operational level have been substantially more effective and successful than I think most people expected them to be, both in Gaza and in Lebanon against Hezbollah, and even in direct attacks against the Iranians. The Israelis are generally believed to have destroyed something like about half of Hamas's force structure in Gaza. They essentially control Gaza to the extent that one can control real estate in this kind of conflict. More about that in a moment. They've wiped out a sizable fraction of Hezbollah's military and political leadership. They've destroyed the majority of what is believed to be Hezbollah's rocket arsenal, which was ordinarily thought to be Hezbollah's primary military threat to the state of Israel. They have, in all likelihood, pretty close to destroyed the Iranian air defense system in a way that would open Iranian airspace to further Israeli military action against targets in metropolitan Iran, whether in the Iranian nuclear system or in their centers of political control or other. So at the tactical and operational level of war, the Israelis have very much righted the ship from the catastrophe that they witnessed on October 7. The problem is at the strategic level of war. There is no evident plan for how to bring any of these conflicts to a conclusion on terms that Israel can live with. And if one worries about tactical proficiency combined with strategic massive shortcomings, one need only look to, for example, Germany in 2 world wars in the 20th century to suggest that this combination doesn't often end well. And there is no clear pathway to any termination of either of these wars that will realize Israeli interests and allow them to return to something that looks like a peacetime posture. My sense of thinking in Jerusalem, actually, is that increasingly they aren't even expecting that or seeking that. That the view in the Israel Defense Force and in the Netanyahu government increasingly appears to be this is going to simply be a chronic, open-ended, non-terminating conflict in which Israel will regularly have to revisit scales of violence on the kind that we've seen in Gaza and we are increasingly seeing in Lebanon without any prospect for a situation in which you can get a long-term stand-down and demobilization, and that's simply going to be the cost of doing business. Whether or not the Israeli state can sustain that is very unclear. The Israeli military is designed to operate in peacetime conditions with a radically smaller mobilized military organization than they're fielding now. The ability of the Israeli economy to function at this scale of mobilization is far from clear, but the absence of any strategy for bringing the war to a successful conclusion means it's not clear how they will ever be able to demobilize. So into this condition walks Donald Trump in January. Trump has said even less about, in concrete practical policy terms, about the Middle East than he has about Ukraine. What he has said, however, is he wants the war to end quickly, don't we all, and he thinks that Netanyahu should do whatever it takes, which has been widely interpreted as carte blanche for the Israelis to use military force in very forceful ways at the tactical and operational level of war without any strategic plan for bringing it to an end. Therefore, I think the likeliest expectation is that's pretty much what we will see. There's been a lot of talk recently about the Netanyahu government trying to offer an inauguration present for Donald Trump in the form of a ceasefire in Lebanon. A unilateral ceasefire with a short term to it is more or less free for Israel at this point, as long as it doesn't continue indefinitely. Netanyahu's right-wing allies in the Israeli government would not tolerate an indefinite ceasefire. They would probably tolerate a temporary one. I'm sure Donald Trump will tout it as the product of Trumpian deal-making, but it's very unlikely to be any more than a very temporary lull in a war that doesn't have any particular logic for conclusion at this point.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. That's you set the table for what we will doubtless come back to from a lot of different dimensions. Thank you. Now I'd like to invite Professor Hosoya, who I think has been thinking a lot about U.S. and Japanese leadership and global frameworks as you think about these emerging and other conflicts.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Professor Janow. I have been enjoying very much the previous sessions, and I now feel that Columbia University students are so envious that you have so many famous professors, gorgeous professors. And I think that I just like to focus on 2 points. Number one, I like to focus on the impact of the current, quite turbulent Japanese politics about global politics. And secondly, I also like to focus on the future turbulent U.S.-Japan relations upon the global politics. Number one, Japanese politics. As you know well, with the end of the Kishida administration, we are seeing the end of political stability in Japanese politics. Now, Prime Minister Ishiba's administration does not have a majority in the lower house, and that would seriously damage the political foundation, stable political foundation of Japanese politics. With that political stability in the last decade or so, Japanese foreign policy has been, from my point of view, quite influential in many ways by providing some of the important diplomatic initiatives such as FOIP, of course, free and open Indo-Pacific vision, and the Quad, as well as the CPTPP. But with the losing of the majority in the lower house, it would be quite probable that Japanese foreign policy will face more challenges in providing a strong diplomatic initiatives. So this is one big disadvantage. But on the other hand, I think that the current government has so many experienced cabinet ministers, like Foreign Minister Iwaya, who was previously a defense minister, and Defense Minister Nakatani, who was defense minister twice in the previous administrations. And also the current special advisor to Prime Minister Akihisa Nagashima is one of the most experienced and fluent speaker about foreign and security policy in Japanese politics. So that's why I think that he can play some important role in strengthening the U.S.-Japan alliance. And also, the current National Security Advisor and the head of the National Security Secretariat, Akiba-san, he has been at the center of Japanese foreign policy in the last 1 decade, creating many, many important diplomatic initiatives. So they are there in supporting Ishiba's cabinet. So I'm sure that with those important cabinet ministers as well as more officials, Japan can provide some important insights to global politics. So basically, I think that the current foreign policy remains the same, with some difficulty in its own political foundations by losing majority in the lower house. But at the same time, I think that Japan can continue to play some important role in global politics. A Japanese role is, of course, unlike the United States, which has a great economic military power. Japanese role continue to be a quite a bridging role between different forces or in a current quite divisive world. And I like to point out three important bridging roles that Japan can play in the coming years. Number one, Japan can play, I think, an important bridging role between the United States under new President Trump and the other American allies. And I will talk about this a little bit later. And number two, Japan can also play an important bridging role between the West or leading liberal democracies of the G7 and the global South. In the last 1 or 2 years, I see that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has been working energetically to bridge the two different worlds, G7 and global South, by visiting many important African countries as well as Latin American countries or Middle Eastern countries. Japanese prime ministers, foreign ministers have been reaching out to these countries to try to be sided with us in creating a kind of a solidarity in international community, because those global South countries are becoming much more antagonistic to the West for some reasons. That's why it is very important for Japan to try to communicate with them by understanding what they're requesting or demanding to the international community. And I think that last year at the G7 Hiroshima Summit, Japan played an important role in listening to their voices. Number three, Japan also played an important bridging role between Europe and Asia by creating the solidarity in the international community soon after the beginning of Russian invasion to Ukraine. I think that Prime Minister Kishida did quite well in persuading other Asian countries on the importance of supporting Ukraine, because around that time, many Asian countries were saying that this is not our war, this is European war, nothing to do with Asia. But Prime Minister Kishida repeatedly mentioned that today's Ukraine would be tomorrow's Asia. It means that if we ignore the damage that we see in the rule-based international order, it would be easier for other countries to easily damage those international law. So that's why I think Prime Minister Kishida played a very important role in bridging two different theaters, I mean European theater and the Asian theater. And then I like to focus on the US-Japan alliance. And like 8 years before, this time Japan could have a sufficient time for prepare for the coming of the Donald Trump to the White House. And because it was quite understandable that American voters would perhaps choose Donald Trump. Of course, we cannot and we couldn't predict the future of American politics, but it was likely to some extent that Donald Trump would win. And well, whichever wins, the truth is that United States is Japan's only alliance partner, and we are weak in Asia, surrounded by 3 nuclear powers, of course, Russia, China, and North Korea. We don't have nuclear weapons. So that's why we need to continue to rely on American extended deterrence. To maintain it, of course, we need to prepare for the time that the United States, American voters chose Donald Trump. So this time they did it, and well, but the issue is whether the next administration continue to maintain the current extended deterrence or current alliance policy in Asia or in the Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific. And I think that the Prime Minister Kishida, again, did very well in his visit to the United States in this April, when he made a speech addressed to the joint session of the United States Congress. He stated eloquently on the importance of the US-Japan alliance by saying, I quote, "I want to address to those Americans who feel the loneliness and exhausting of being the country that has upheld the international order almost single-handedly. I understand it is a heavy burden to carry such hopes on your shoulders. Although the world looks to your leadership, the United States should not be expected to do it at all unaided and on your own," unquote. And also he added by saying this, I quote, "Japan believes in the United States leadership, and we also believe in the US economy. Japan is the #1 foreign direct investor in the United States. Japanese companies have invested around $800 billion, creating almost 1 million American jobs," unquote. So you can easily understand that this is quite Trumpian words. And Japanese government officials, Prime Minister Kishida, more or less prepare for the time that the American voter would criticize, well, like trade deficit as well as a much smaller Japanese role in defending its own country. But still, for the purpose of persuading American people, Prime Minister Kishida decided to double our defense budget. And also, Japanese government has been saying the Japanese important role in the United States to create jobs as well as to vitalize the American economy by providing a #1 foreign direct investment in the United States. So in this way, I think that the #1 priority for Japanese Prime Minister is to try to persuade not the only American president, but to American people on the importance of the continuation of alliance relationship with Japan. And I'm not quite sure whether this is quite effective to the next president, but anyway, I believe that Japan needs to continue to rely on American extended deterrence. In addition to this, Japan has been enhancing our security partnership with other like-minded partners like UK, Germany, Australia, Korea, and so on. And these are working well. By doing this, I think that Japan can play a larger role in the years coming ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. A lot to pick up on that front as well. And now let me welcome Zoe Liu back to Columbia and Weatherhead. She's one of our postdocs, and we consider her one of our own, although she's moved on to the Council on Foreign Relations, thinking very broadly about what is occurring within the Chinese economy, U.S.-China relations, and China in the world. So thank you, Zoe.
Thank you very much, Dean Janow, for having me. And I also wanted to thank my good friend Ayumi for inviting me. It's truly a great pleasure and honor to be here because Ayumi and I have a special relationship in the sense that we both are alumni of the Columbia Harvard China and the World program, of which Professor Tom Christensen is supervising here. So I consider this as a very neat community, and thank you all for sharing your time with us today. I guess what I wanted to start is by reminding us that, in fact, 15 years ago, back in 2011, about 51% of Americans think China as a relatively favorable country. According to Pew Research statistics, that it was sort of the highlight of public opinions in the United States towards China. But 2 years later, in 2013, the majority of more than half of Americans consider China as unfavorable. And the latest number in this year showed that over 80% of Americans consider China negatively, and 4 in 10 out of American people surveyed consider China as an enemy. So I just wanted to throw it out there by saying that, this is U.S.-China relationship is arguably the most important bilateral relationship in the world. And a lot of the international orders and the changes of it is perhaps going to be impacted by how the bilateral relationship is going to change. And as Dean Janow mentioned earlier, perhaps we need to construct a coalition of willings in terms of upholding the liberal international order, of which the rise of China has benefited from. But starting from 2018, as the rising tension of U.S.-China trade war, and after 2022, Putin's invasion of Ukraine and the West collective sanction against Russia made Beijing to not only double down on self-sufficiency domestically, but also pursuing and expanding a China-led alternative international trade and financial system. So with that, I guess what I wanted to focus on in the next few minutes is to focus on perhaps 3 points. The first point, I wanted to start zoom in on the economy. And the message here is that the Chinese economic trajectory today is on a much weaker stand compared with when President Trump first came into power in 2017. And the second point that I wanted to make is that although the Chinese economic trajectory is weaker, that does not necessarily mean China's international influence is going to collapse. Or for that matter, China is no longer going to be relevant. But in fact, although a domestically, economically challenged China is facing a lot of problems that the President Xi Jinping has to solve himself, but then at the same time, China is doubling down on constructing a China-led global system, not just in terms of trade, but in terms of building an alternative renminbi-led or renminbi-based global financial institution and architecture that can potentially help China weaken its vulnerabilities to U.S. sanctions. And last but not least, I wanted to sort of put end on a positive note by saying that President Trump does not need President Xi Jinping's help to solve Americans' problems. But President Xi Jinping perhaps would need President Trump's support to restore confidence in the Chinese economy by easing China's tension with the rest of the world. Now let me just quickly, I forgot to set my timer. Let me quickly start on my first point in terms of economic trajectory. From the way that I think about the Chinese challenges to the Chinese economy is through the lens of 4 Ds. 4 Ds. The first D is debt. Second D is demand. Third D is demographics. The fourth D is decoupling or de-risking. Debt, I think for folks in this room, you don't need me to remind you that China has a lot of debt problem, not just at a local government level, but increasingly at company level as well as the household level. And in terms of macro leverage ratio, China is over 280% in terms of debt to GDP. In other words, the debt stock to GDP is about 3 times. That is not sustainable by a lot of measures. That is debt. And then if you look at the recent stimulus measures, a lot of yes, there was a 1.4 billion stimulus, but about half of that money is used to help local government to retire or to retire the hidden debt and encourage them to be honest with themselves, to put your off-balance sheet financing on the balance sheet. But this does not solve the stock of that problem. Now, when the economy was growing very fast and the GDP growth was faster than debt growth, growing debt is not a problem. But now, as GDP slows down, debt growth continues. This is not going to be easily resolved. And if you take a look at the numbers, local governments are very reluctant to issue new debt. Part of the reason is because it's almost to a career suicide when the big deleveraging campaign is going on, and yet you are going to tell the rest of the rest of China saying that, well, I am building up my debt. That is a career suicide. But then on the other hand, local Chinese banks and underwriters, they become very skeptical in terms of writing new debt for the local government. So that's on the debt problem. And then on the demand problem, it's not just China is going to face increasingly greater headwinds in terms of export, not just from rising tariffs from the United States or European Union or Canada or Brazil or Indonesia or Vietnam, but also because, and perhaps a bigger challenge, is chronically slower growth or low consumption at home. It's not about aggregate demand. It's about household consumption. And just put this in a global context, global-wide average household consumption as a percentage of GDP is about 60%. But this number, household consumption as a percentage of GDP growth in China, is about 38%. And naturally, people ask this question, why Chinese people are not spending? And it's not that the Chinese people was not spending. There was a time when Chinese consumers was going around the world and buying Louis Vuittons. And when Chinese people stopped buying Louis Vuitton during COVID, and in particular this year, you realize that the luxury market putting out a report saying that, well, you know what, we are all having a difficult time. It's not that Chinese people don't like spending. It's that there is a tremendous weak confidence at household level. And this lack of confidence at household level is not ungrounded. 2016, when President Xi Jinping just started his second term, Chinese household from 2020 to 2016, you can expect Chinese household double their income, their household wealth every 7 to 8 years. But from 2017 to 2024, the average Chinese household wealth growth have been halved. In other words, in order for Chinese household to double their wealth, you now need to have at least 14 to 15 years. And the expectation is that, well, my income growth is going to slow, my wage is going to grow slower, and I might get laid off. So of course, Chinese families are not spending, and demand side is not speaking well for the Chinese economy. And then the next one, demographics. A lot of people talk a lot about, well, China has experienced 2 consecutive years of negative population growth, and this basically means the labor market premium for Chinese economic miracle is going to be no longer there. And it's not just that. Slower population growth supported by or resulted from lower family formation ratio, meaning folks are not getting married as many as before. That basically means demand for housing is going to slow down. And housing constitutes for about 30% of the Chinese GDP. It's not just that President Xi Jinping's housing market crackdown contributed to the slower growth of the housing market. There is a fundamental shift in the demographics. So going forward, this 30% of GDP is going to suffer from a lot of challenges. Now people are saying that, well, President Xi Jinping is doubling down on technology, and a lot of the focus on investment in technology is hoping that they can basically contribute to the portion of GDP growth that used to be contributed by housing market. But the problem is, with export controls, with investment screenings, with a lot of the related to the fourth D, de-risking or decoupling, companies are becoming, not just foreign companies become hesitant to expand their investment in China, but the Chinese companies themselves are reluctant to invest in China. Instead, they wanted to invest in tariff-passing countries like Indonesia, like Vietnam, like Mexico, or for that matter, Morocco and Turkey or Hungary. So from that point of view, none of these 4Ds speaks well for the Chinese economy. But this does not necessarily say the Chinese economy is going to collapse in the next year or in the next 5 years, or for that matter, the Chinese influence overseas is going to depreciate. And I have about 3 minutes, and I'll finish within the next 3 minutes. So, and the reason I say that is specifically because China has been doubling down on building an alternative trading system and the use of renminbi in cross-border trade and settlement, not just to solve China's domestic problem, but also learned a lesson from the West sanction against Ukraine, especially financial sanctions. Now, on the trade front, regardless of tariff or not, Chinese companies are going to go out. Part of the reason is because massive investment at home lead to intense competitions at home, price wars lead to very thin profit margin at home. Naturally, Chinese companies are going to expand overseas, regardless of whether there is tariff or not. But a tariff combined with President Xi Jinping's incentive to support Chinese companies to go overseas basically feed into the broader overcapacity narrative, and that is going to double down on the West, or for that matter, emerging market economists' suspicion of cheap Chinese export. And China's response has been so far accelerating the negotiation of free trade agreements, one of which is not just Peru recently, but also the negotiation between China and the Gulf Cooperation Council member countries. And then, on the other hand, witnessing the potential risk of being cut off from US-led global system, you started to realize China has been actively expanding the renminbi-based global financial system. That is domestically, it's called CIPS, the cross-border interbank payment system. But using this system, you started to see in the recent BRICS summit in Russia, President Xi Jinping and the BRICS leaders, or the China version of a coalition of willings, talked specifically about building a BRICS version of a settlement, or BRICS narrative of a SWIFT plus a settlement system. And just put this into a little bit of context, to what extent China has been practicing the use of renminbi in international cross-border settlement. Using Russia as an example, about 90% of China-Russia trade now are settled in renminbi. So from that point of view, China's anti-sanction mechanism today is perhaps more robust. Not perfect, but robust compared with 2017. Now, let me conclude by saying why I think Trump does not need Xi Jinping's support to solve Americans' problem. Part of the reason is because America has a natural endowment, from oil to gas to a lot of technologically advanced and not just companies, but expertise in universities. Unfortunately, I'm not have confidence in President Trump's his personal attachment to university or intellectuals. I'm not confident about that. But remember, if we can learn a lesson from COVID, despite a lot of chaos in the White House, in the executive branch, American people, American executives, they themselves bandwagon together, realize the need to revitalize America among societal level. Whereas you don't see this in China. In China right now, at least from September to now, every month you hear or you read news about a fatal stabbing and people killing not just school children, but just random Chinese people. So the social pressure in China, as well as Chinese people's vote of confidence by not spending, basically signaled that President Xi Jinping really need to ease China's tension with the United States to begin with, in order to convince the Chinese people that he actually cares about the economy and he cares about Chinese people's household. So from that point of view, I'm not optimistic about the trajectory of U.S.-China relationship going in the next administration. But that being said, given that Trump's his personnel appointment and everything like that already showed his chaos in the House, hopefully the wheel and the machinery of government is turning slowly such that the damage can be controlled. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, Professor Tsuruoka, I know you have written a lot on the Indo-Pacific area as well as U.S., Japan, and more broadly. So please share your thinking.
Oh, thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. And I've been very enjoying this conference already, and also I very much thank the organizers, particularly Ayumi, Han, and others. But it's really good to be a final speaker in the final panel. So, but the problem is that I'm feeling a sort of what is called a final speaker syndrome, which means that all the important things have already been said, and people are getting tired. So but still, the good thing about being a final speaker is that I can take advantage of what has been said. So I think I'm going to
talk about three things mainly, and the first on Ukraine, and then the NATO, Japan, and the NATO IP4 cooperation, and also the a bit related to that, the about more cooperation with like-minded countries, including Australia and European partners. So first on Ukraine, that just 2 days ago, the Foreign Minister Yuichi visited Ukraine. Yesterday, former foreign ministers, so Hayashi and Kamikawa also visited Ukraine. But this case, what is quite remarkable is the fact that Mr. Yuichi visited Ukraine in his first visit abroad after becoming foreign minister. So it has demonstrated a lot that Japan is still very much committed to help Ukraine. But of course, at the same time, I'm fully aware that there are some Americans who argue that Japan should focus on its own region rather than paying attention to Ukraine. Yes, there are some trade-offs between the European theater and Indo-Pacific theater, and yes, the Japan has huge homework in terms of enhancing Japan's own defense posture, and also the cooperating with other countries in the region. Of course, that is very much important, and that is perhaps more important than engaging in faraway regions. But still, Russia is Japan's neighbor as well. So in terms of thinking about the strategic landscape in Northeast Asia, of course, you have Russia, of course, as well as China, North Korea, and other countries. But so the helping Ukraine and imposing sanctions on Russia is seen as very much part of Japan's own national interest. So because Russia winning is not what we want to see, and aggressors getting benefit from aggression and invasion, and that is something we don't want to see. And also that the democracies showing that they cannot sustain what they said they would do, that's also something that we need to avoid, particularly given the fact that Beijing is watching what Japan is doing and what the international community and what the G7 countries are doing. So if we give to China a message that if you can wait 3 years or 4 years, then the democracies will just give up. That's a message that we don't want to send to Beijing. So that is why the stakes are really high for Japan, and but at the same time, it's quite legitimate for us to talk about ending the war. Yes, of course, we want to end the war, and that is good. But it's very wrong to believe that you can get peace agreement if you just force Ukrainians to make concessions. No, that's not enough, because for us to make a deal, that you need to force Russians to make concessions as well. So that's exactly what the Professor Biddle said, and I fully agree to that. And so the situation is not simple. So that is why whether we can continue what we have been saying we would do is very much at stake. So that is why still that the Japanese government is really serious in its engagement in the war in Ukraine, and the supporting Ukraine and imposing sanctions on Russia. And related to that, it's really remarkable that NATO's cooperation with what is called IP4, the Indo-Pacific 4 countries, so Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand. So for 3 years in a row, from 2022, 23, and this year, that the IP4 countries were represented at NATO summit, and Prime Minister Kishida attended all the 3 summit meetings. And for the first time last month, the NATO defense ministers meeting invited IP4 countries, and Defense Minister Nakatani visited and participated in that. So it's now a sort of commonplace for for us to see IP4 countries participating in NATO meetings, and that is really new. And also between NATO and Japan and NATO and other countries, other NATO partners in the region, that there have been various practical cooperation. So in the Japanese case, that the cyber security or maritime security and women, peace and security, and these are the things that we have been doing in the context of what is called practical cooperation. Of course, practical cooperation is important, but I very much believe that now it's time to think more about deterrence, because the stakes are really high, and the stakes are much higher than practical cooperation. So when former Prime Minister Kishida started saying that the Ukraine today could be East Asia tomorrow, of course, at that time already, that the level of connectivity between the European theater and the Indo-Pacific theater was substantial, but that level of connectivity has been increasing since then. So we have been seeing deepening cooperation between Russia and China, and also the North Korea's direct participation in Russia's war of aggression, and based on these new developments, that now the stakes are much higher, and how we could enhance, how we could strengthen deterrence in both regions, in Europe and in the Pacific, is getting more important. So yes, there are trade-offs when it comes to specific capabilities, particularly the missiles and the air defense systems and ammunitions and the reconnaissance and intelligence and those capabilities, particularly the UAVs, and so there are various trade-offs between the two regions. But what is more important actually is that in terms of thinking about deterrence in the Indo-Pacific region, or defense of Japan from a Japanese perspective, that we need to think of a situation where if and when, for example, Estonia, one of the Baltic states, is invaded by Russia, and assuming that US is involved, then assuming that the NATO will have to rely on reinforcements from forces and capabilities and assets from mainland US, then that, of course, could directly impact the US posture in the Pacific region, and also vice versa, that in Europe, you have to think of the impact from for example, Taiwan contingency. If something really serious happens over Taiwan, and assuming that US is involved, then that, of course, would have huge impact on the US military posture in NATO. So that means that the Japan will have to take into account such scenario. So the reinforcement from mainland US may not be always available if European contingency happens before Taiwan contingency. And that is why the Japan needs to take into account that in its own defense planning. And also you can say that it's in Japan's interest to help deter Russia from invading Estonia, for example, and vice versa, that Europeans have to take into account such a possibility of the US involvement in Taiwan contingency, and then sometimes that the reinforcements from the US mainland may not be available all the time. And that also means that in NATO's defense planning, that sort of scenarios will have to be taken into account. And that is why that it is in Europe's interest to help deter China from invading Taiwan. So that's sort of so how we could make deterrence more resilient across the regions and beyond regions. That is very much important. And finally, just a few words on the increasing cooperation between Japan and other like-minded countries, particularly the Australia and European countries like the UK, France, and NATO and the EU. So the first thing I would like to emphasize here is that it is not for the purpose of substituting or replacing the U.S. alliance systems in the region or the U.S.-Japan alliance. Because what Japan is trying to do is to build additional layers of security in the region. So and in that context, it's no coincidence that Australia, UK, France, Germany, and these are all U.S. allies. So it is essentially about cooperation between U.S. allies in different regions. So and that is why, from a Japanese perspective, what is important is to sort of make possible for UK, France, and other European actors to be plugged into the U.S. alliance systems and what U.S. alliances are doing in the Indo-Pacific region. So that is why that the various cooperation between Japan, Australia, and the UK, and Japan, Australia, France, and that sort of a cooperation is becoming more important. And for the moment, yes, when it comes to doing joint military exercises in the region, that the many of which have been sort of, I'm sorry to say this, but they're sort of primitive, and sometimes it's called the friendship exercise sort of things. But this needs to be upgraded. So it needs to be. We need to be more serious and vigorous in doing exercises with European partners in the region, because it's, at the end of the day, is about enhancing deterrence. So it's not just for a mutual understanding and friendship. So now the not only NATO-Japan cooperation, but also the Japan's strategic relationships with the UK, France, and these European partners, the strategic meaning of that is on the rise. So it's time to be more serious, and then it is, at the end of the day, about encouraging the continued U.S. commitment and engagement in the Pacific region and in Europe as well. So it is about the cooperation between U.S. allies, and part of the reason and part of the purpose of that is to encourage and make it easier and possible for the U.S. to maintain its commitment and engagement in both regions, in the Pacific and Europe. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I guess I'd like to start by, I have so many questions for each of you, but I'd like to ask Steve Biddle a further question and then invite our other panelists to react to his answer a little bit more, because I think, Steve, you've outlined, very initially when it comes to Ukraine, a scenario, at least one scenario, where Russian expectations of success have increased as a result of their ground action, and to put some constraints on that or manage an armistice or other solutions will require escalation, and that the dangers actually go up for others. And I wonder if you could elaborate on that scenario, and who the dangers, who is most affected by that, and what that could mean for U.S. allies. Because I think, what we've just heard from Professors Hosoya and Tsuruoka, particularly Tsuruoka-san, you have taken the conversation further than others I have been exposed to about how far might Japan need to go under different scenarios. And I must say, I don't have a sense how much discussion there has been in Japan, or how prepared Japan would be, depending on those scenarios, to, put self-defense forces in harm's way, in putting people on the ground in different parts of Europe, other things other than the very substantial steps that Japan has already signaled about increasing defense preparedness, increasing defense spending, doing more in the Asia-Pacific. I wonder if you could take that further, Steve, where you see the threats needing to go, what would be a scenario that could implicate Japan, and get your reactions to that?
Yeah, I mean, if Trump thinks he needs to make an escalatory threat in order to induce appetite suppression on Putin's part, the question is, what can he do that hasn't already been done that isn't really, really dangerous? I mean, there's been an escalatory process that's been going on for 2 years now on both sides. There's a certain tendency in this debate to assume that escalation is this binary nothing or nuclear war relationship. And of course, that's not the right way to think about it. Escalation is a ladder with many rungs. Yeah. Both sides have been walking up this ladder progressively for 2 years now. And as a result of doing this for 2 years, U.S. magazine depth is now quite limited. I mean, a lot of what people would want us to give to Ukraine, we have now given to Ukraine. Our ability to provide more air defense to Ukraine is limited by the size of our own stocks and the other needs we have around the world. Our ability to provide more long-range ATACMS missiles to Ukraine is limited by the scale of our own stocks and our demands elsewhere in the world. So you need to be able to draw something out of the quiver that you haven't already drawn, and that doesn't seriously, result in opportunity costs elsewhere around the world. And that's beginning to get to a fairly small set. So, and A. B, Donald Trump isn't famous for being patient and moderate. So I'm now going to engage in some wild speculation. I apologize for that in advance, right? But it's not implausible to me that Donald Trump could threaten to make the U.S. a co-belligerent in the war, to have the United States Air Force start attacking Russian targets. Now, that would be a serious escalation that would get Putin's attention. It would also be immensely risky and dangerous. But again, in an environment in which the less escalatory, less risky options are getting close to tapped out, what else is left? So the other side of this that's worrisome, of course, is that escalation is a game that two can play. And the two have been playing. As I was suggesting earlier, both sides have been walking up the escalatory ladder progressively for 2 years. It's entirely plausible that Trumpian escalatory threats that are designed to get Putin to accept concessions that Putin wouldn't otherwise choose might very well be met instead with parallel escalations on Putin's part. Now, there are a variety of options that Putin has that he hasn't yet chosen, but like us, the less dangerous of them have already been largely exhausted, right? So Putin escalated when he mobilized 300,000 additional soldiers for the Russian army. Putin escalated when he annexed 4 oblasts of Ukraine. Putin escalated when he began a strategic bombing campaign against Ukrainian cities. Those things are all done, right? They can't be threatened again. So what else is left? Well, things like escalating an ongoing espionage campaign against civilian targets in Western Europe. Things like striking targets in Poland. The Ukrainians are heavily dependent on logistics assets and repair and maintenance facilities in Poland for the conduct of the war in Ukraine. Poland has been a sanctuary heretofore because it's a NATO member. The second law of thermodynamics does not mandate that Poland will be a sanctuary. Right, so there are a variety of things that the two sides could threaten in an attempt to gain bargaining leverage because they are now insisting on an early deal, whereas before the Biden administration was patient about waiting for a later deal. But the options that remain are increasingly escalatory, which is why they haven't been chosen so far.
Okay, thank you. And Zoe, I'll come back to you if you don't mind with a further economics question, but may I invite our panelists to react to those actually not as scary as I thought, except the first one. But would you care to comment further on that, those scenarios? Does that, as to how Japan might, if it were to respond as robustly as it could. How far do you think it has thought through what that could be?
Right. Thank you for the question. First of all, I think that we learned many lessons from our history between 2014 and 2022. And I basically feel that we were too much sensitive and naive to Russian retaliation or Russian escalatory measures to the West, because Japan, I would say, was the most concessional to Russia in that period, because we wanted to create a peace treaty, peace deal with Russia, particularly on the territory issues. And we thought that we could have some concession from Russia, but we had nothing. And it's a kind of a Russian provocation to escalate to the West, as well as Russian way to lure Japan by showing some willingness to go ahead with the peace treaty. But we could get nothing out of that. So we really need to understand that Russia so far is much weaker militarily than we thought. And also, Russia is much less willing to escalate because of the weakness. So in this way, I don't think that we should provoke Russia. Russia is a great power, and Russia has so many nuclear weapons. So we don't have to escalate. We don't have to provoke Russia. But at the same time, we were perhaps too sensitive and naive towards Russia on that matter. So in this way, we have to be cautious to try to contain the conflict. But at the same time, we don't have to be lured by Russian provocations as well as Russian way to attract some of the Western countries. And at the same time, we need to, at the same time, control Ukraine as well, because we have to be careful about how Ukraine is willing to escalate the tension or the conflict. So maybe we have to be cautiously optimistic about the way how we have been dealing with Russia in this measure.
Okay, thank you. Tsuruoka-san, would you?
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, it's quite true that the deterrence is mutual. So NATO is deterred by Russia, and Russia is deterred by NATO. So even if you don't want to accept that, it's just a reality. So NATO is deterred by Russia because of the fact that Russia has a lot of nuclear weapons. And but at the same time, it's very important to note that Russia is also very much deterred by NATO. So deterrence is working still. So that's a good news, and that is why we need to continue deterrence. But what I believe is important, particularly at the level of perceptions, that we need to avoid a situation where people think that the NATO is unilaterally deterred by Russia. So that sort of perception, and giving that sort of perception to the broader world, including Russia, is not in NATO's interest. And one more thing to add is that because of the decreasing U.S. and other countries' stockpile, what I believe is important, and which is becoming more important, is the need to ensure weapons and ammunition supply chain security. So how we could improve our weapons and ammunition production capability, and yes, that the individual countries need to do that, but at the same time, there needs to be more more linkages between like-minded countries, and now South Korea is playing a very big role in providing weapons and ammunition to the US and to various European countries. And so Japan's weapons and ammunition production capability is quite limited. So how we need to think about how we could strengthen that and expand that, and that is very much a challenge common to various the US allies, of course, including the United States. So this is something we could more think of as a sort of a cooperation item for US allies. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And if I may ask, Zoe, you've given us a very good picture of the challenges that China is facing domestically in its own economy, but also it has continued to advance a strategy of engagement around the world with countries and finding some receptivity to that. We know that, China has dealt with the president-elect in a trade war and has become a sophisticated respondent. When Trump imposed tariffs the first time, Chinese eventually retaliated. They did so, like all of our trading partners, by trying to target those parts of the United States that would be most disadvantageous to the Republican Party. And so, we know how to do trade wars, economics for economics, and still not have other spillovers necessarily. And yet we're now at a weaker Chinese economy, stronger U.S., very different geopolitical context in which this will occur. Do you think this will have the same dynamic we've seen before, or do you think it will have a different dynamic of the trade war? Because we know that's coming.
Thank you, Dean Janow, for the question. I like how you describe it in particular, the previous, we know how to do trade wars and do trade wars without negative spillover. But I don't think this time is going to be the same. For the most important reason is that economic issues, unfortunately, have been overly securitized, not just in the United States, but also in China. And Tsuruoka sensei just talked about the importance of weapons supply chain security, and that just was one example. One case recently developed that China has been practicing in terms of China's practice of its developing its own anti-sanction regime is to deny Chinese suppliers, battery suppliers, to supply to American drone companies that supply drones to Taiwan. So from that point of view, I don't think the trade war, this tick for tat, is going to be in the same flavor. Instead, we might see China not only try to weaponize its own control of critical materials, and the reason why China might be more willing to use it this time than before was specifically because the recognition of the time is going to run out going forward as the rest of the world is developing their own processing refining capacity. The Japan's economic security strategy, EU's economic security strategy, all have important element of critical mineral supply chain security, and the Biden administration established critical mineral security partnership. So for China, the future of weaponizing its dominance in critical mineral is running out. You might as well use it now.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I think we only have a couple of minutes. Should we take one or two questions and let the panel respond? If there are questions, otherwise I'll just happily keep going. Comments? Sir, yes, Kento.
Thank you very much. It's a fascinating session. I guess it's a sign of the times that in a session on the international order, we only heard the term G7 once, and I don't recall hearing UN system or WTO or anything else mentioned. I work for an organization that does humanitarian assistance and development called Peace Winds, and I've been spending a lot of time in Africa and the Middle East and Southeast Asia. And really the three forces there I talk to people on the ground and even people in war zones that are really shaping their lives right now are climate change, global health issues, and migration and mobility. I'm curious, after the elections with the U.S. receding from global leadership, and in particular for Hosoya Sensei, where do you see global leadership on these core issues coming from that aren't about major power conflict, but that fuel that, and I think they're fueling, frankly, our own politics in the U.S. certainly, and Japan as well. Thank you.
So we'll collect one more question, I think, up here. And I think, this panel has interpreted global order as major power conflict and the role of different major important countries in that. So you've opened a very big subject with that question, but if colleagues have a quick comment at the end, please.
Thank you. I particularly would like to ask about like international trade. Like I think 2 days ago, like in Chinese President like Xi Jinping, he specifically mentioned that APEC summit that he's trying to create a kind of international kind of agreement, like a new agreement. And I kind of wonder, it's a kind of it's not the battle, but like it's a very conflict. For example, RCEP, CPTPP. I kind of wonder, it's not only like a Chinese issue, but I kind of wonder like what's the view of like next international trade free agreement? Like it's a very broad question, but I would like to hear the opinions.
Well, I'd like to invite the panel to close us out with your thoughts on, is there, really I synthesized both of these, is where could we take the system forward if we were trying to imagine a path forward? Would you like to start it off this time, Tsuruoka-san?
Okay, thank you very much. Where should political leadership come from? That's what I'm wondering. And the good example is that during the first Trump administration, that after the U.S. left TPP, that the Prime Minister Abe and some other like-minded countries, they tried to salvage that, and then that came to be a CPTPP, so TPP 11, and that was a great example of how we could complement and how we could build a sort of alternative, without the U.S. leadership, and also the another good example of what happened in the first the early period of the first Trump administration was the EU-Japan FTA. So the negotiations on between Japan and the EU at the time were a bit stagnant, and people are getting more skeptical about the eventual conclusion of the FTA between the EU and Japan, but helped by growing fears of protectionism by the Trump administration, that the EU and Japan, Tokyo and Brussels, managed to agree to that. And that was also a great example. And so how we could they provide the sort of interim leadership in the world, so in the field of international trade particularly, and that is really important. But also that it's very much about political leadership. So that means that the fact that the Ishiba government in Japan has only a minority in the lower house, so minority government, that is really weak. And that's actually one of the most inconvenient differences between now and the 2017-18 the Abe government. So I'm not too optimistic, but still I believe that there are things that other countries can do. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll pick up on the second question, if I may. I think you're absolutely right. President Xi Jinping did talk about his vision for not necessarily just the global trade, but also even a new version of Chinese reform, and in particular open up, including the opening up of cross-border data trade, digital transformation, and even the opening up of internet. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but you are right. China is actively, or under President Xi Jinping, he's actively promoting an alternative vision, not just for a global order, but more specifically on trade, on even human rights issues, and on financial issues. But that does not necessarily mean China is in denial of Western liberal order. Part of the reason is because China benefited, especially the double-digit growth era. China benefited from the US-led global system. And this is the key why I think it is very important for President Xi Jinping and his cadres recognize the need to ease the tension, to no longer fire up the tension with the West. Otherwise, the downward spiral or the negative sentiment in the Chinese economy, both among Chinese household and international consumers, are not necessarily going to be there. He trowed out this multilateral international order, especially in a multipolar world, perhaps in a good timing in terms of President Trump is coming back to the White House, and given that President Trump not only killed the TPP, but he also killed the WTO. And during the Biden administration, you never hear people talk about the WTO. If I try to talk about the WTO, I know I am fighting a losing battle. So from, I said it. So from that point of view, if you contrast President Xi Jinping's talk at APEC versus his talk at the BRICS summit in Russia, he's not about. If he was about anti-American, anti-West in Russia, he's not about anti-American. And in fact, in his meeting with President Biden, he was talking about his readiness to work with President Trump, but he's not afraid of a fight if it's needed. Again, I don't know what that means, but it speaks to the fact that domestically he's doing self-sufficiency, but internationally he tried to reduce China's vulnerability to Western sanctions.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let me just briefly answer to Jim's question.
I'm afraid I've managed our time poorly because we have such a fascinating group. So could I ask each of you just 1 minute each?
1 minute, yes. Japan will present two different contradictory faces from now on. Number one, Japan need to present a face of a leading defender of the liberal international order. With this face, Japan, I think, continue to defend both UN humanitarian activities and cooperation among like-minded partners. But at the same time, I think that Japan will present the face of the closest ally to the United States under Donald Trump. And Abe did brilliantly to present two different languages. And I think that the Prime Minister Ishiba needs to do that. I stop here. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. That was very, very succinct. Thank you. Steve.
I mean, the Trump administration is famously hostile to multinational institutions, and I see no reason to expect that to change. They have a very transactional, narrow conception of self-interest rather than broad, short-term focus rather than long, and a very zero-sum conception of the relationship between states. All these things are antithetical to any kind of transnational cooperative organization, and so I don't expect them to be any more enthusiastic about them now than they were the first time.
Well, thank you very much. I have to say I agree with that, but I do think that there is room for bilateralism, and there is room for market access, and there is room for achieving peace and stability. And I think all of us have been talking about the risks, but also the narrow pathways forward. So please join me in thanking this excellent panel.
Thank you so much. So now we conclude our full-day conference. But before we close out, we have had multiple co-sponsoring institutions, and I would like to invite directors of those programs to say a few words, either here or you can take the microphone over there. First, we have Professor Christensen, Director of China and the World Program, to say a few words, and then Professor Nishino and then Professor Curtis would come up.
Shall we slip off?
Sure.
Thanks, Ayumi. Thanks again for putting together this incredible event. It was a really great day. China and the World program at Columbia University is really proud to be a co-sponsor of the event. But the really big part of the event for me is the Weatherhead East Asia Institute, and under Hang's terrific leadership. And it's just been such a great organization for so long. And we saw two of the champions of that organization in action today, and Jerry Curtis, and Carol Gluck. And I think that so many of us have benefited directly or indirectly from the work that they've done over the years for Weatherhead. And I'm really proud that 2 of my former fellows were presenters today. China in the World has a global reach now with over 50 former fellows. Ayumi is a champion, and so is Zoe Liu. And I was just really proud of them today. I have to run off, so I am going to unceremoniously grab my stuff and leave because I'm going to miss a train if I don't. But thanks again to Ayumi, and thanks to all of you for coming today and for all your active participation in the event. Thanks.
So thank you for all coming today and staying at the end of the event. I want to extend my sincere gratitude again to Columbia University for organizing the event. Especially thank you, Dr. Ayumi Tsuruoka, for her effort in bridging between the Keio and the Columbia University. I'm now serving as director of East Asian Institute and also serving as a director of Contemporary Center for Contemporary Korean Studies at Keio University. This year marks 40th anniversary of our institute, which was established in 1984, and 15th anniversary of our Korea Center, which was established in 2009. We also have a Center for Contemporary Chinese Studies, which has around 20-year history. So in this context, it's really my pleasure to co-host the event and revitalizing the relationship with Weatherhead East Asian Institute at Columbia University. I really hope that this relationship continue longer. So next year, we, Keio University, will invite you and organizing the event in Tokyo. We, Keio member, really looking forward to seeing you again in Tokyo. So see you next year in Tokyo. Thank you.
Well, I think you'll all agree with me. This has been really a wonderful day. I've been at a lot of conferences over the years, and this one just stands out in so many ways for being innovative and interesting. And of course, it's a very critical time in world history, and we don't know what to expect from the next president of the United States. I want, first of all, to thank the participants who came from Japan to this conference. They all arrived last night. Some of them are leaving tomorrow, or those who are hanging out are going to be leaving on Wednesday. It's an extraordinary dedication that they have that would get them to make this trip and to be so active in participating in the conversation. And listening to the conversation, what struck me is how important it is for us to hear in this country, for us to hear Japanese views on the issues that we've been discussing. Traditionally, especially in the political world, Japanese politicians come over. They meet with the president. They look at the president, try to get a sense of what he wants to hear, and they basically tell him what he wants to hear. That's not what we need in this current day and age. We need Japanese who can explain what their views are and how they can help us Americans understand a part of the world that they know much better than we do in East Asia. So I think this conference, somewhat to my surprise, we never intended it. I don't think Ayumi thought that this would highlight as much as it has the differing perspectives, both among Americans and among Japanese and between Americans and Japanese. So I think we need to think hard about how we sustain this kind of frank dialogue. And what we probably cannot accomplish, but we should try anyway, is how could you get someone like President Trump to actually listen to people who have different views and not just get angry and dismissive. But there are ways, and you know, I've been around for a long time. I first was I joined the East Asian Institute exactly 60 years ago when I was a graduate student, and I can't tell you how proud I am about what the institute has become over these years, especially the last few years with Hang as our head, and wonderful people like Ayumi and others involved. But I think that we need to think hard about how to structure coming meetings that will give people in government access to the kind of thinking and insights that you, the Japanese participants here today, who are not in official positions, who can actually speak their minds, don't have to read from the Gaimusho script, and the same with us in dealing, telling Japan what our views are as Americans. This is what I think that's the main thing I take away from today. Been a lot of changes over the years, and I think, I don't want to go on. I'll stop with it after this, but it brought back memory. You know, a memory of mine, the late 1970s and early 80s, when Prime Minister Ohida and then Prime Minister Nakasone were in office. They each created brain trusts. People like your former colleague Kamiya Fuji and Satoshi Saburo and Kosaka Masataka and others. They were regularly being consulted, and they were able to talk to the public about Japanese foreign policy and what's going on in the world in ways that were very important. And they could talk to Americans as well. I think we need to think about that kind of a brain trust. We need a brain trust here in the U.S. to do that. And the other thing in those days that was very popular was Wise Man's Group. There was a U.S.-Japan Wise Man's Group. Well, we should think about a U.S.-Japan-Korea Wise Man's Group of non-official people who interact with government, who interact with the public. We're living in a very dangerous time in our history. None of us have any idea where we're going in the coming months and years, especially with the political change in this country. All we know is we will have a new president who is an isolationist, a protectionist, and unpredictable. I think the role that academics and policy-focused academics can play in trying to help us think through what the options are and where we're going, never been more important. So I think this may be the first of what I hope is a series of intense interactions that will help us all sort of find our way forward. So I thank you all for coming today. You've all been very patient. Somehow you managed to stay warm or kept your coats on or whatever. But it's been a great day, and thank the journalism school for setting this up. And, huh?
Thank you for Julie and Susie for helping.
And because Ayumi doesn't give me a minute to get my thoughts together. I thank Ayumi, I thank Julie, I thank Susie. They all did a really wonderful job, and I thank you. Thank you very much.